Today's visitor to the city of Volgograd, on the banks of Russia's mighty river Volga, will be most struck by its massive 200-foot World War II memorial. This commemorates the dead of Stalingrad, the city's former name. The preserved relics of the bitter fighting in and around Stalingrad during the latter part of 1942 and early 1943 also symbolize one of Hitler's greatest blunders. Over 250,000 German soldiers were trapped in the city. Hitler's obstinacy in refusing to allow them to break out of their pocket not only caused the deaths of almost all of them, but also marked the major turning point of the war on the Eastern Front. The German blitzkrieg, which struck Russia on June 22, 1941, was initially a dazzling success. Relentlessly, the panzers swept eastwards. Hundreds of thousands of stunned Russian soldiers were trapped in their wake and forced to surrender. Hitler looked certain to crush Soviet Bolshevism. The harsh Russian winter brought the German onrush to a halt at the beginning of December 1941, just a few miles away from the Soviet capital. In the immediate aftermath of the failure to capture Moscow, Hitler sacked a number of his senior army commanders. Most notable was Field Marshal Walter von Brauchitsch, the German army's commander-in-chief. Hitler declared that he would personally take over his position and control the army's operations himself. Hitler had been meddling in military operations since the beginning of the war, but now he was to exert an increasing iron grip, one which was to have ultimately fatal consequences. The German army spent the winter of 1941 and 42 on the defensive. But Hitler was determined that once the Russian spring came, his armies would again take to the offensive and crush the Soviet Union. This time, Moscow would not be the objective. Instead, Hitler turned his eyes southwards to the industry-rich area between the rivers Donets and Volga, and to the Caucasus, which had extensive oil fields. Fedor von Bock, who commanded Army Group South, was put in charge of this ambitious operation. He was ordered to subdivide his command into Army Group A under Maximilian von Weiss and Army Group B under Ferdinand List. While List was to thrust eastwards towards Stalingrad to protect Army Group A's open flank, von Weiss would make the advance into the Caucasus. Army Group A launched its attack on June 28, 1942. List began his offensive 10 days later. To avoid becoming trapped, the Russians withdrew their forces in the face of the German advance. This frustrated Hitler. Mistakenly believing that large numbers of Russian troops remained west of the River Don, he halted the advance on Stalingrad and switched most of its armor to Army Group A. Hitler's meddling continued. Dissatisfied by what he saw as von Bock's tardiness, he sacked him and dissolved his headquarters, enabling the Führer to take direct command of von Weiss and List. On July 25th, List's Army Group A broke out of its bridgeheads on the lower Don and plunged into the Caucasus. The advance was rapid. Soon the terrain became a desert. The first oil fields at Maikop were seized on the 9th of August, but the Russians had destroyed most of the installations. Meanwhile, just 5 days after he had removed most of its tanks, Hitler ordered the German Sixth Army to resume its advance on Stalingrad. Friedrich Paulus, who commanded this army, had a reputation for obeying orders to the letter. He made no objection. Even though his lack of tanks meant slow progress. Neither Paulus nor his men realized that Hitler was becoming fixated by the city that bore Stalin's name. This was to put them on a road that would end in death and destruction. Stalingrad was originally known as Tsaritsyn, but changed its name after Stalin assumed power on the death of Lenin in 1924. The justification for the name change was that the new Russian leader had played a major part in the defense of the city during the Civil War of 1918 to 1921. Soon, Stalingrad became a flourishing communist city, acting as a conduit for the produce of the vast collective farms which surrounded it. It also became a major industrial center based on its vast tractor factory. By the beginning of August 1942, the plant had switched to the production of T-34 tanks, which would become one of the Red Army's war-winning weapons. Hitler had now switched considerable air support from the Caucasus to support Paulus' advance on the city. This helped the German Sixth Army to approach the outskirts of Stalingrad by the 10th of August. The Soviet High Command became aware of the threat and hurriedly mobilized Stalingrad's citizens to help prepare defenses in front of the city. Andrei Yeremenko and Nikita Khrushchev of the newly created Stalingrad Front were in charge. The first direct German attack on the city came from the air. This was a prelude to the ground assault. As attention began to focus on Stalingrad, far to the south, the German offensive in the Caucasus was grinding to a halt. The men of Army Group A had reached the foothills of the Caucasus Mountains, but their supply lines were now very stretched, and they were feeling the lack of air support. On the 23rd of August, German mountain troops placed their flag on the highest peak in the range, Mount Elbrus. Thereafter, the advance gradually petered out. Meanwhile, Stalin had issued orders that Stalingrad was to be held at all costs. This was not just because it was named for him. He feared that its capture would isolate southern Russia. He sent his chief troubleshooter, Grigory Zhukov, to oversee its defense. Russian reinforcements began to arrive, and the Germans faced even stiffer resistance as they approached the suburbs of Stalingrad. Throughout September and October, the struggle continued, with mounting casualties on both sides. The combat was especially fierce in and around the ruins of the tractor factory. Vasily Chukov and his 62nd Army, who were defending the city, eventually found themselves clinging on to just a narrow strip of the city on the west bank of the Volga. All supplies and reinforcements had to be ferried across the river, which was under constant German fire. Winter now arrived, and the heavy German casualties forced the High Command to turn to the armies of Germany's allies. Two Romanian armies now protected the flanks of the Sixth Army and Hermann Roth's Fourth Panzer Army, which was helping Paulus. The Russians took note of this, and Zhukov began planning a counteroffensive. In the north, Nikolai Vatutin's southwest front and Konstantin Rosokovsky's Don front would attack the Romanian Third Army, while part of Andrei Yeramenko's Stalingrad front would assault the Romanian Fourth Army in the south. On November 19, 1942, the southwest and Don fronts began their attack. Next day, it was the turn of the Stalingrad front. The offensive sliced through the Romanians. On the 23rd of November, the two prongs linked up. The German forces at Stalingrad were now cut off from the remainder of Army Group B. The following day, Hermann Göring told Hitler that his Luftwaffe could keep Paulus resupplied. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast rather than break out. This was to be an ultimately fatal blunder. Göring's boast that air resupply could maintain the German Sixth Army in the Stalingrad pocket was an empty one from the outset. Paulus needed a minimum of 750 tons per day, but the Luftwaffe only had a capacity for a third of this amount. The winter weather meant that this was seldom achieved. Hitler now planned a hasty operation to relieve the Sixth Army. He placed the man who was generally considered to be Germany's most capable commander, Erich von Manstein, in charge, creating Army Group Don for the purpose. This also took Paulus under its command. But while von Manstein was preparing for the relief operation, the Russians struck again at Army Group B, this time along the river Chur. They failed to break through, but von Manstein was forced to deploy some of the forces earmarked for the Stalingrad relief operation. This caused the attack to be postponed. At the same time, the Russians also attacked into the German pocket at Stalingrad, with the aim of splitting it in two. Paulus's men resisted fiercely, and the operation failed. On December 12, 1942, with the Russian offensives halted, von Manstein was finally able to mount Winter Storm, his relief operation. It initially went well. The advance then began to slow as the Soviet defense solidified. Even so, von Manstein continued to push forwards. Von Manstein now proposed that Paulus break out and link up with the relief operation. The Sixth Army commander, conscious of Hitler's order to stay put, declined. It is also doubtful whether his men, now facing slow starvation because of the shortage of food, had the strength to do more than defend. On the 19th of December, the Russians renewed their attacks on the river Chur, this time concentrating on the Italian Eighth Army. They quickly broke through and captured the main airfield supplying Stalingrad. This attack presented a threat to von Manstein's lines of communication and forced him to halt. Worse, on Christmas Eve, the Russians attacked again, this time against the Romanians in the south. Even Hitler recognized that Army Group Don was in danger of being encircled. And on December 28th, he sanctioned a withdrawal. This would put the main German forces 135 miles away from Stalingrad. Not only would this make Paulus more isolated than ever, but the problems of resupplying him by air became even greater. Now the Russians could concentrate on reducing the Stalingrad pocket. They planned to attack from the west and drive the Germans back into the city itself. But first, on January 8, 1943, they sent emissaries with surrender terms to General Paulus. He rejected them. 2 days later, the final Soviet offensive against the Stalingrad pocket began. By now, the Luftwaffe was delivering a mere 40 tons per day, its aircraft taking out wounded on the return journey. Marauding Soviet fighters shot down ever more German aircraft, aggravating the supply problems. Göring's deputy, Field Marshal Erhard Milch, took charge, but even he could not raise daily deliveries by much. Matters were made worse by the fact that the Russians were now overrunning the airfields within the ever-shrinking Stalingrad pocket. Eventually, the Luftwaffe was reduced to the desperate measure of dropping supplies. As Paulus's men struggled back into Stalingrad itself, they did so in the knowledge that Hitler had now refused to allow anyone to break out. The Soviet pressure on the German Sixth Army was remorseless. By the end of January 1943, the German hold on Stalingrad had been reduced to just 2 small pockets within the city itself. On the 30th of January, the anniversary of Hitler's coming to power, Göring made a special broadcast in praise of the defenders of Stalingrad. Paulus declared that he would never surrender, and Hitler rewarded him with a promotion to Field Marshal. But he knew that the situation was hopeless and expected Paulus to commit suicide rather than disobey orders. He was to be disappointed. On the following day, January 31st, 1943, Paulus and the troops in the southern pocket laid down their arms. The strain of fighting a battle that could have only one outcome showed plainly on Paulus' face. Those in the northern pocket held out for another 48 hours before finally accepting the inevitable. The surrender of the German Sixth Army at Stalingrad was to be the turning point of the titanic struggle on the Eastern Front. For the first time, the Soviets had inflicted a decisive defeat on their adversary. From now on, the Red Army would be continually on the offensive, an offensive which would finally end in the ruins of Berlin in May 1945. "91,000 German soldiers went into captivity at Stalingrad. They left the corpses of 110,000 of their comrades in the pocket. Hitler's fixation with Stalingrad had caused his soldiers to be trapped, and his obstinacy was to be their death sentence. So bitter were Paulus and some of his generals that they became tools of Soviet anti-Nazi propaganda. Paulus's anger toward Hitler would remain with him for the rest of his life. Only 5,000 of the 91,000 Germans who went into captivity with Paulus ever saw their homeland again, and then only long after the war was over. The others died of disease and starvation in Soviet prison camps, victims of Hitler's refusal to face reality. Such was the legacy of Hitler's blunder at Stalingrad, a blunder that turned the tide on the Eastern Front.